We're going to go to Summit County next, where Jacqueline has a question about the federal government's involvement in federal lands. Jacqueline, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Jacqueline.
Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Doing
or Senator
great.
Lee, excuse me.
Hey, I answered both names.
I am asking specifically about what the Senate can do to rein in, like, the FBI and things that have happened in other states with the recent death of Lavoy Finicum. I realize that we may not all agree on some of his tactics, but it feels as though our federal government is using their land management as a way to control people in these relative states. In Utah and Summit County specifically, we have grazing rights like these, and the BLM is controlling them, and we're wondering when we're going to be next.
Yeah, no, that's a legitimate question. I'm glad you're willing to raise it, Jacqueline. Thank you for calling in and raising that issue. First, I want to say that as a matter of first principles, I don't personally see the need for each of these federal agencies to have its own police force, especially where increasingly we're seeing them develop an almost militarized police force, and where many of them have SWAT team-like presences. I think this could inevitably lead to conflicts, and I don't see a good reason why the BLM ought to be maintaining its own law enforcement presence. It would be one thing if we had a patently inadequate network of state and local law enforcement officials, but we don't have that in Utah. We've got some of the best law enforcement personnel in the entire country right here in our own state. We're more than capable of maintaining law and order, and to the extent that federal land managers need to draw on the resources of state and local law enforcement officers, they can, and they will, and they frequently do. And our state and local law enforcement personnel do a great job of that. So I'm looking very seriously at whether we even need to have a separate law enforcement wing of agencies like the Bureau of Land Management. And I can tell you where I expect to come out on this is that we probably don't. I would like to see us phase those out, and I'd like to see the Bureau of Land Management and other federal land management agencies have to rely on state and local law enforcement. I also think, Jacqueline, that it's important for us to remember that the federal government was never intended to be, and certainly shouldn't be intended to be, the biggest landowner by far in the United States. It's certainly, even if it's going to be the biggest landowner, it certainly ought not own 30% of the landmass in the United States, and it definitely ought not own 2/3 of the land in the state of Utah, which it does. This is a big problem. It makes it harder for us as Utahns to do everything we need to do, particularly at the local government level. It makes it harder for us to fund everything from primary and secondary education to law enforcement to fire and rescue services, because in so many of our counties, most of the land is owned by the federal government, and that land is therefore taken out of the tax pool. We're eligible to participate in that program called PILT, Payment in Lieu of Taxes. But in most parts of the state, that pays pennies on the dollar compared to what our local taxing jurisdictions would receive if that land could be taxed. And so that brings to mind the broader issue of disposal. What I would like to see ultimately is for the federal government to start disposing of federal public land. Now look, I'm not talking here about national parks, about declared wilderness, things that have already been set aside. I'm talking about standard garden variety public land that's just out there, that's owned and managed by the federal government. There's no reason why our land should be controlled by government bureaucrats who answer only to Washington, D.C. and who have no connection to the local government. But back to your question again, the federal officials at a minimum should defer to local sheriffs, should defer to local authority. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that that happens, because that's the way our federal republic is supposed to work. That's the reason we have a constitution. We need to follow it. And I appreciate you raising this question, Jacqueline.